Johnny Carson was known to millions as the charming and witty host of The Tonight Show. His smile, his timing, and his easy presence on television made him the king of late-night entertainment. But off camera, things were very different. Behind the curtain, Carson had a reputation for being cold, calculating, and even cruel. Colleagues often described him as a man who could turn on people in an instant. One moment he was friendly and warm, and the next he could cut you down with a cold remark. In Hollywood, this double personality was almost like a survival skill, but Carson perfected it. He wasn't remembered only for his talent. He was also feared for his grudges. If Johnny Carson didn't like you, there was no coming back. His silence, his refusal to invite you back on the show, or his decision to ignore you could end your career before it even started. For many comedians, the dream was to not just perform on Carson's show, but to be invited to sit on his famous couch. That invitation was a golden stamp of approval, a sign that you truly belonged. But Jerry Seinfeld, despite his talent and rising success, never received that blessing. Carson didn't just ignore him, he seemed to dislike him, even hate him. Why was that the case? What made Seinfeld stand out as a target of Carson's coldness? To answer that, we need to understand the very different worlds these two men came from, and why their styles and values clashed so strongly. Carson came from a tradition of comedy where vulnerability was key. To him, the best comedians were those who revealed something human in their jokes: pain, humility, or heart. His belief was simple. Good comedy should make you laugh, but also make you think, and maybe even cry. That was his code. He liked performers who opened themselves up to the audience and allowed people to connect with them on a deeper level. Jerry Seinfeld, however, was the complete opposite. His comedy was precise, polished, and carefully designed like a machine. Every pause was calculated, every punchline measured, and every story stripped of personal emotion. He was detached from the material. For the audience, this was brilliant. They laughed at the sharp observations and clean style. But to Carson, this was hollow. He saw it as comedy without a soul, entertainment without humanity. Carson believed Seinfeld's work lacked vulnerability, and that made him distrust and dislike him. He refused to give Seinfeld the couch nod, something that Carson reserved for comedians he truly respected. The absence of that invitation spoke volumes. It wasn't just that Carson didn't like Seinfeld's style, he actively rejected it. To him, Seinfeld represented a new kind of comedy that he thought was shallow, arrogant, and disconnected. This difference in approach to comedy became one of the core reasons why Carson never warmed to Seinfeld, and why his dislike only grew as Seinfeld became more and more successful. The power Johnny Carson had in show business cannot be overstated. For decades, The Tonight Show was the single most important stage for comedians. A successful performance there could make your career overnight, while failure could end it just as quickly. Carson knew this, and he used that power with or sometimes cruelty. He was known to keep a mental record of people who crossed him. And once you were on his bad side, your chances of success in late-night television vanished. He didn't always need to say harsh words. Sometimes silence or exclusion was enough. This quiet punishment was more terrifying than open anger, because it meant your career could simply disappear without explanation. Stories about his drinking also painted a darker picture. When Carson drank, he could become mean-spirited, cold, and unapproachable. Colleagues said he was terrifying at times, with a temper that could flare at the smallest provocation. In his personal life, this controlling and suspicious nature carried over. His marriages collapsed in ugly divorces, with one of them involving him breaking into his wife's secret apartment because he believed she was cheating. These stories built an image of a man who demanded respect and control, but rarely returned kindness in the same measure. In this kind of environment, Jerry Seinfeld stood out. He was independent. He didn't flatter Carson, and he refused to play the Hollywood politics game. That independence was seen by Carson not as strength, but as arrogance. And for Carson, arrogance was unforgivable. One of the reasons Carson's dislike for Seinfeld is so interesting is that it exposed his own double standards. Carson was known for demanding originality and humility from the comedians he approved. He valued authenticity and often criticized others for stealing material. But Carson himself wasn't free from those accusations. He was said to have borrowed, or outright stolen, material from other comics, including Steve Allen, Rodney Dangerfield, and Jonathan Winters. Some of his recurring characters and sketches were heavily inspired by routines done by others before him. In the comedy world, stealing jokes is one of the worst sins, and Carson, despite his reputation as the guardian of comedy, broke that rule more than once. To younger comics, including Seinfeld, this hypocrisy was hard to ignore. Here was a man who demanded others bow down to his rules, but he bent or broke them when it suited him. Carson's entire system of rewarding and punishing comics was built on loyalty to him, not just on talent. If you pleased him, you were in. If you didn't, you were out. Jerry Seinfeld didn't bend, didn't flatter, and didn't play into Carson's need for control. Instead, he built his career without that approval, and that was perhaps the greatest insult of all. Seinfeld proved he didn't need Carson's couch or his blessing to rise to the top. And that was something Carson could never forgive. In the 1990s, Jerry Seinfeld's career exploded. His sitcom, Seinfeld, became one of the biggest television shows of all time. It wasn't just a hit, it became a cultural phenomenon, defining an entire decade of comedy. The show's success meant that Seinfeld was now more than just a comedian. He was one of the most powerful figures in entertainment. Carson had once been the king of late night, the man everyone had to pass through to gain legitimacy. But now, he had to watch as a comedian he dismissed and disliked became bigger than he ever was in terms of influence. What stung even more was that Seinfeld's brand of comedy had no space for the traditions Carson valued. It wasn't about storytelling or emotional connection. It was about precision, cleverness, and detachment. To Carson, this wasn't just a different style, it was the death of the craft as he understood it. And yet, Carson never publicly attacked Seinfeld. He didn't need to. His silence was enough. No invitation, no praise, no recognition. That absence of approval was louder than any insult he could have spoken. But for Seinfeld, Carson's silence didn't stop him. Some say it even motivated him. He became proof that you didn't need Carson's crown to be king. The very independence that Carson hated became the key to Seinfeld's triumph. And in the end, that was the most bitter truth of all for Johnny Carson. Even though both Carson and Seinfeld moved in the same world of comedy, their interactions were always surrounded by tension. Carson never warmed up to Seinfeld, not even in public. For a man who could charm millions of viewers with his smile, Carson's coldness towards Seinfeld stood out. It was not loud or obvious, but people who worked behind the scenes noticed it. Producers, writers, and fellow comedians whispered about the distance between the two men. Some said Carson thought Seinfeld's style of humor was too lightweight, not as sharp or challenging as the comedy he respected. Others believed Carson simply disliked Seinfeld's arrogance. Whatever the reason, Carson's silence spoke volumes. He had a way of ignoring people he did not respect, and ignoring Jerry Seinfeld was, in its own way, the biggest insult he could deliver. This quiet war between them showed that not all show business feuds are noisy. Some are just cold walls that never come down. The divide between Johnny Carson and Jerry Seinfeld was also about their approach to comedy itself. Carson came from a time when comedians often told long stories, shared emotional truths, and built their humor around characters and life experiences. He believed in comedy that had a bit of depth, even if it was still light-hearted. Seinfeld, on the other hand, built his career on observational comedy. His routines were about the small, everyday details of life, waiting in line, losing socks, or arguing about cereal. For many fans, this was brilliant because it showed humor in the ordinary. But for Carson, it may have seemed shallow or detached. He valued comedians who revealed part of their soul on stage, while Seinfeld worked hard to keep his own life out of his comedy. This difference was not just about jokes, it was about philosophy. Carson saw comedy as a reflection of life's struggles, while Seinfeld saw it as a way to laugh at life without taking it too seriously. What also fueled the clash between Carson and Seinfeld were their personal choices and how those choices played out in public. Carson had a reputation for being cruel in his personal relationships. He went through 3 divorces, with stories of drinking, temper, and emotional distance following him for years. While he appeared as the friendly, smooth host on television, people close to him described a man who was lonely, moody, and often angry. Seinfeld, in his own way, also carried scandals. One of the biggest shocks came when he dated a 17-year-old high school student. While he was almost 40, the media covered it, but Seinfeld brushed off the criticism, claiming it was not a big deal. To some fans, this revealed the same coldness Carson had been accused of, an unwillingness to see how his actions might hurt others. Both men were experts at performing warmth on stage, but often failed to live it in their private lives. This made the conflict between them even more believable. They saw in each other traits they could not stand in themselves. Show business is not only about talent, it is also about power. Johnny Carson had been the king of late-night television for decades. His approval could launch a comedian's career, and his disapproval could bury it. When Seinfeld came along, he did not seek Carson's approval. He built his career differently through stand-up gigs, smart writing, and eventually his own show, Seinfeld. This independence was something Carson did not like. He preferred to be the gatekeeper of comedy, the man who decided who deserved fame. Seinfeld ignored that system, proving he could succeed without Carson's blessing. To Carson, this may have felt like a loss of control, a reminder that the entertainment world was changing. The old guard no longer had the same grip on power, and the new generation could rise on their own terms. That silent defiance may have been one of the deepest reasons behind Carson's dislike. One of the most telling details of their relationship is what Carson did not do. He never openly attacked Seinfeld, never insulted him in interviews, and never went on record about his dislike. Instead, he chose silence. For a man of Carson's stature, silence was louder than words. He had the ability to destroy people with a joke. But by refusing to engage with Seinfeld at all, he sent a clearer message: "You do not matter to me." This form of rejection was subtle, but in Hollywood, it was brutal. Many comedians would have begged for Carson's approval or fought for his attention. Seinfeld, however, simply went on with his career. In a strange way, Carson's silence and Seinfeld's indifference mirrored each other. Both men preferred distance over confrontation, both were emotionally detached, and both carried grudges quietly. Their feud was not the type filled with headlines and public fights, but one that lived in cold stares and unspoken dislike. Today, when people look back at Carson and Seinfeld, they remember them as legends in their own right. Carson is still regarded as the gold standard of late-night hosts, a man who defined television for decades. Seinfeld is celebrated as the star of one of the most successful sitcoms of all time, with his humor still influencing comedians today. Yet, the quiet hostility between them adds a fascinating layer to their legacies. It reminds us that behind the laughs, comedy can be a world of ego, pride, and unspoken rivalries. Carson and Seinfeld may have made millions laugh, but they could never bridge the gap between their two worlds. Their feud shows that even in the business of laughter, bitterness can last a lifetime. In the end, they were two men who held up mirrors to each other, and neither liked what they saw.